First histology we are going to look at in Lab 18 is the hypothalamus. And for this lab, I highly recommend checking out those histology resources. Right now we're looking at the Histology at Yale University resource, but the Human Protein Atlas also has some really good examples that we'll look at today. So we have here the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. To orient ourselves, we want to find this piece up top. This is actually part of our hypothalamus. So there is not too much to know histology-wise about the hypothalamus. That said, it does have some important functions. So hypothalamus is our endocrine control center. It is maintaining homeostasis for the entire endocrine system. So it is very vital to making sure our hormones are maintaining that homeostasis. We are going to see some terms over and over again when we talk about hormones, and I may mention a couple examples of them. Things like releasing hormones are going to stimulate secretions, whereas inhibitory hormones are going to kind of decrease or inhibit hormone secretions. So things like that are going to be controlled from this endocrine center, this hypothalamus. So all of this tissue here in pink is going to be just a little portion of that hypothalamus. We also have a little bit of our optic chiasm. So this is going to be a little more anterior. We're on the anterior part of the brain, and then as we move posteriorly, we encounter that hypothalamus. Now I am going to show the labels in just a second, but before that, I want to draw your attention to our pituitary gland, and that is this tissue connected by that stalk or that infundibulum to our hypothalamus. And if we noticed the color here, our hypothalamus has the same color as half of our pituitary gland. We can think of this as kind of one continuous structure with the same type of material. Let's contrast that to this other half of the pituitary gland, which is much darker, and we'll see why that's darker in just a second. If we zoomed in, we'd also be able to see lots and lots of cells within this darker part of the tissue. There's a reason why these tissues look different under a microscope, so let's go ahead and add those labels. So again, we have hypothalamus. This is going to be our optic chiasm, which is kind of crossing over as that connection point between our two optic nerves. We have a stalk or infundibulum connecting the hypothalamus to specifically the posterior pituitary gland. And this is important. So posterior pituitary gland actually is an outcropping of our hypothalamus. So it is the same type of tissue. It's the same neural tissue. The reason our anterior pituitary gland looks so different is because this has a different embryological origin. So posterior pituitary came from a hypothalamus. Anterior pituitary actually comes from kind of the roof of our oral cavity. So it has a different histological origin. Anterior pituitary is mostly cellular, and that is part of why it has this darker appearance. The anterior part is also highly vascularized. So if we zoomed in here, we would see tons and tons of capillaries that typically stain darker on a slide. So that explains why the anterior pituitary is much darker in color. It's almost purple versus this kind of continuous material here is a little lighter pink. And we would expect this to all be neural tissue, the hypothalamus and that posterior pituitary gland. We're going to zoom in now. Hopefully I've driven that home for you. So we're back to the anterior pituitary gland. We have zoomed in from this dark part, and now we're looking at individual cells. So they're still dark stained. We're going to have basically 3 different types of cells that are categorized based on how much color they take up from the stain, and that's why we see these terms acidophil, basophil, chromophobe. Acidophil and basophil tend to take up a lot of stain, so they appear darker and more colorful on a slide. Chromophobes are, if we break this word down, it means afraid of color, essentially. So they're a little clearer. They don't take up as much stain. So that's the explanation behind these terms, but you don't really need to know that for the lab exam. I just want you to be able to recognize that this, or if you were given the information that this is part of our pituitary gland, I want you to recognize that this is anterior pituitary. We can tell that because all of this tissue is cellular. We're back to those cuboidal cells, that repeating pattern over and over again. So that is how we know this is anterior pituitary. This is producing many, many hormones. We're not really going to talk about them in this class, but just keep this information in mind if you do go on to take physiology. So let's switch gears now. That was all anterior pituitary. Now we're going to talk about posterior pituitary, that outcropping of the hypothalamus. So already this looks a little different. It's lighter stained, and we don't have many cells at all within this posterior pituitary. The reason is most of what we're dealing with on the slide is going to be axons from neurons that actually originate in that hypothalamus. So if we go back to our starting point here, the neuron cell bodies are going to be found in the hypothalamus, and then they're going to have axons extending all the way into our posterior pituitary gland. So that is that very important connection part. Sometimes you will see the posterior pituitary referred to as the neurohypophysis, and that's a long mouthful of a word, but I want you to focus on the neuro part. Neuro referring to the nervous system. And all that means is the posterior pituitary is going to be a connection, an extension of our neural system. Functionally, it is a little different. So we're going to have those neuron cell bodies sitting in the hypothalamus. So up here, they are actually going to be releasing two hormones that will be stored and released into the posterior pituitary. So this posterior gland is not actually producing those hormones itself. It is just a storage and release point. The hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus are going to be oxytocin and vasopressin. So they're made up here, stored down here. And that is the main difference between anterior versus posterior pituitary gland.